All righty then. A little bit of a different start. How are we doing? How are we doing? Hey everybody, how are we doing? Welcome to another episode of The Living Room. As usual, you're here with me, Andre, and my good friends Mark and Philip. And we, as usual, are just gonna have a good Caribbean conversation as we just look and see what's been going on, what we've been up to over the past couple of weeks. We didn't have a show a couple of weeks ago. Apologies for that. But nothing that we could control there. But we have a really good show in ready for today. So, guys, how we doing?
Yeah,
Good,
doing
man.
well.
Doing good, man. You're tying up your words there, man.
See me fumbling
You
my
all
words
right?
there, man.
That's happened.
Jeez,
That's
hombre.
happened.
The lesson is don't drink sugary stuff before you speak. That's the thing. You're
What
swallowing
sugary
all the
stuff you
time.
was drinking?
Look, learn just a little
A
juice,
little
just a little
Kool-Aid.
juice. Yeah, Kool-Aid.
I know it. It's stirring someplace.
Man,
Somebody's stirring it.
You can pretend now that you know about Kool-Aid, right?
And
Enough
tang and
Kool-Aid.
ting, man.
Kool-Aid and Tang.
Man, I mean,
Tang,
we
tang, man. Tang was a staple.
probably got enough Kool-Aid to last me a lifetime, right?
Natural ingredients.
Gosh, yeah.
Kool-Aid. I'm sure it had like 90% real juice.
Yeah, man.
Juice of the powdered kind.
Of course.
Real juice, man. Real
man.
juice, real juice. Made with proper juice. Made with proper juice, man. Of course it was
Yeah.
made with real
We
juice.
didn't know about him.
I believe so.
We didn't know
I
about him.
believe so, man.
So you be
No, I
keeping your
don't think
eyes
we know.
across the region, man, and seeing what's going on as usual. Know
I
what it's
always
like.
keeping my ear to the ground and seeing what's
Mm.
going on
Man,
at
yeah,
home and
man,
stuff.
yeah.
We're catching your eye. We're catching your eye.
Well, I think the thing that caught my eye this week was the return of Donville, man. Donville it is.
Okay.
In
Man,
Barbados. Yes.
I saw Donville return this week to Barbados to a huge entourage. It looked like I was like, yeah,
Was it really that huge though? I
Really
didn't know if it was
really
that
going on here,
huge.
man. you think it was a small gathering?
I think it was a small gathering, man. I don't think it was
Okay.
that many people. I think people blowing that out of proportion. I
Aye.
see more cameras and thing there than I see people actually welcoming Donville back home.
Fair enough.
So it's just the way how the pictures crop make it seem like hundreds of people were there, but I don't think no hundreds of people were there.
Man, it look a bit strange to me, man. It looks strange. That's all I can say. It look a little strange.
How?
Strange. Man, I would have thought if you've been locked away in the United States for some time that you
Yeah.
I would have sneaked into Barbados, go up in North Point and keep myself quiet.
Okay.
Oh, you mean why come in with all the fanfare?
Man, it
But-
feel a little bit strange to me.
Yeah,
man.
but maybe that's his way of saying I have nothing to hide. You know, I've done my time. I wasn't really guilty,
I ready for the next election
and
cycle.
I just backed. Yeah. Yeah.
You reckon?
I do not, man. You're right in the fact that I don't know why it was so much announced that he was coming back, and the way how that was done. I had, escorted out because I think he was escorted out by immigration officers. He was literally the only person who was coming out, so no one else was honestly coming by private plane. I don't know how he got home,
I doubt it.
but
Hey, he just said
it's-
90 back
I doubt it
here.
but you're right that it was strange. But I can't, I can't believe that he has any political future. But I don't know.
Boy,
Things are
Caribbean
strange.
is a strange place. You never know.
Caribbean is a very strange place.
These funny people, yeah.
Well, true. But I was listening to something even today. Donald Trump get indicted, and they were saying there's actually no law that stops him from running. And there's a
Yeah.
possibility
That was fascinating.
Man, this is the
I'll say
United
that.
States of
Yeah.
America, man.
There's
You
a
know what?
there's a possibility that he could run, be indicted on trial, convicted, and get elected president.
I mean, some people
So
would say there's
there's-
absolutely no difference. He was a criminal in 2016. He's still on out.
No, this is true, but a conviction makes it.
Yeah.
So there's actually nothing stopping him, and I would presume that even in Barbados, that there's nothing stopping
Man,
Donald.
Donville,
I think for the
Donville gonna be on the platform in next election. What you gonna say?
but will he be running? Speaking, but will he be running? That's the thing. I would think
That'd be up to your
that it would
party.
almost. I think it would be political suicide for the Democrats to have Donville out any platform,
Right.
because they're trying to rebuild trust. They're trying to regain some, some kind of dignity
Mhm.
and trying to connect with people, that's just gonna give more fodder
Yeah,
to
yeah,
throw at them
yeah.
if he even
It's true.
steps up on a platform.
It's true.
Yeah.
And even with the crowd that was with him at the airport, that's what I was looking for. I was looking to see, are there any officials for the Democratic Labour Party in this crowd?
Welcome home, comrade.
Because if there was any, that would just be crazy.
Mm.
That would just
Yeah.
be crazy. But I don't think so. I think I only saw one guy who ran at the last election who was there at the airport, but I don't think I saw anyone
Interesting.
else. But I think it'd be political.
I think the other thing that caught my eye too was I see the Jamaicans getting really excited about champs, man. You know, the their school championships, and
Oh yeah.
it's fantastic, man. Such a great model in the Caribbean where
Mm.
I think I watched it last.
Yeah.
I watched some of it last
Incredible,
year
man.
online, or when was the last time that they held it? I don't remember if this is the first time since all the COVID stuff. It's different.
man, yeah,
Different level.
completely
It's different.
different level.
It's
man.
different. The athleticism of the kids, and then the support that they get from the public.
Incredible.
I mean, the school championships in Jamaica is like nothing that
This
you
is a
see. It's
big
almost
deal.
like
Like Carifta.
Yeah.
well, no, I was gonna say it more like US scholastic
College.
sports.
Yeah, yes.
Where you get thousands and thousands of people, not just that go to the school, but
Mhm.
from from the neighborhood wherever the university or stuff is, and thousands of people turn up to college games. It feels like that very much so in Jamaica. So I pay attention to it because every year new stars
Oh
born.
yeah. Oh yeah.
coming out
Absolutely.
coming out of that. So I like to watch it. It's good fun. So
Yeah.
I would definitely be seeing what's going on there. I see Barbados had ours too, but we had our into school sports.
It seemed like
In the
a
school
little
sports
bit
just happened
different.
last week, wasn't it?
Yeah, it did, but it's
Barbados
like
did.
It seemed slightly different.
it's
I don't know if
zonal.
it's because obviously
It's zonal.
Yeah.
It don't feel as though the schools are collectively how it used to be back in the day when we were
well, we don't
observers.
have a stadium.
When we were
We
observers.
don't have a Oh, I used to run, man.
I never see you around yet.
Don't mind he feel, man.
I never ran
Don't mind,
away.
man.
I never run away. But we ain't got a stadium, so you can't bring everybody together. So the zonal
Well-
thing was all a convenience, more so than a change in
Mhm.
program.
Maybe when Motley built her 15 stadiums, we won't have a problem.
Hey, you remember when you at school you used to got the pen with the oil and the wheeling around the track and you can't really see it because it's dark, right? That's what's gonna get built down there. I can tell you that's as good as a thing.
Man, you watering down Prime Minister Motley's ambition, man. Come
That
on,
is
man.
bare foolish talk, man. That's bare talk.
Okay.
You know that's bare labber, man. You know that. But I also, cause you hear anything about it in the budget that just come up?
Man, she mentioned she mentioned some stuff about it, and actually, I see flyovers back on the table, and I think these two things can be linked together. I think this whole roads and infrastructure thing. You watch and see just now, man. You watch and see.
Will you tell me your theory? Tell me your theory. Don't tell me what
We
you
can
see,
get-
man. Tell me your
We can
theory.
get about 100,000 Chinese coming in to
Well,
build
all
these flyovers and
Mhm.
these 15 stadiums. What do you guys see?
Okay.
So you think that these 15 stadiums will be built?
I got a sneaky feeling she can do something. Yeah. I got a feeling because she's born like crazy. So
Well, the
Mm.
thing that got me about the budget in Barbados here recently is that Prime Minister Motley's talked for about 4 hours.
man, yeah, long.
You had a preamble about 3 weeks of all kind of seemingly almost trying to create a select committee feel, and it was bare nonsense. 4 hours, announced a whole peripheral of things, but not. I don't even know if it was 20 minutes of how to pay for it.
Nah,
And then afterwards, all the senators and all the different ministers, now that the budget is over, talking about all this under the table funding and this £1 billion coming from this place and the next place and the third. Like, but we just had the budget and we ain't here about none of this.
where all this coming from though?
What was all this nonsense?
Yeah. So, but it would surprise
But
me
so-
if we start to see some traction in that.
So you think the flyover is gonna finally happen?
But no,
We've been talking about flyovers for
no,
decades.
don't get me
now.
wrong. I think the flyovers is a fundamental mistake, right? I absolutely think,
Why?
because I do not think that the problem in Barbados is going to be solved by building more road infrastructure. The- the-
Use be road. Use be resident road man.
I'm a transport
So
specialist, man. You can say it.
use be road man. Use be road man.
the,
So
the,
so
the,
so you don't
But
think
but the
no,
problem
is
the
the
problem
right thing?
is traffic.
the,
So
the,
how you
the,
can solve that problem?
because, man, how much time I said on this show, the problem in Barbados is that there is no vision or plan for the future of transport. You can't keep buying buses and building roads. That's not
Mm-hmm.
solving a problem. That's sticky tape.
Okay.
You know,
Well, that's the case on a lot of things. And then the real issue for me in the Caribbean, and I will speak of Barbados, is that I don't think people want to make the hard
they
decisions.
don't.
Some hard decisions need to be made as far as how we move forward in development.
Yeah.
What do we first of all determine what development is for us,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then how we link in to the rest of the world, the
But
rest of the
once
world's
we've
development,
established
wherever
our
that is.
basis for
Yeah.
But
this
yeah,
is
but
what we
establish
do.
where we want to go,
Mm-hmm.
not just follow pattern.
Mm-hmm.
We talking what we want all electric cars by 2030. You see,
I can't even chops hard
listen.
enough.
We talking about all these things. In other words, we running after the trappings of development without going back to the basics and putting in a foundation and actually coming forward with a vision and a strategy. And that's the issue that you have.
And the
to
reason,
do that, some hard decisions gotta get made.
yeah, and the hard,
But nobody wants to do it.
one of the hardest ones is those things can't be fixed in a political cycle, right?
No.
You have to lift the political maturity of the place to get to a different direction. And that is where you can
Exactly.
constantly be making these cyclic decisions that, you know, there have been bad buses
And
in Barbados since I was a boy. We still doing
exactly. And what you might put in place today, you might not be around to see come to
it.
fruition.
But that doesn't matter.
And you
And
gotta
that should be
get to the
fine.
point that is
That's okay. That's
okay.
okay. That's okay.
That is okay for the development. And then of course this nonsense of whenever you change leaders, that they do away with the projects that the previous government was doing and start over again.
Mm.
All that nonsense needs to change. But some hard decisions need to be made, but no one wants to make them. No, and that's the real issue.
Indeed.
But hopefully one day we will get there. But look, I'm excited about today's conversation, guys.
Sweating, man.
We've been talking. Yeah. I got my tissue here, and you know, boy, heads and sweat don't work. So
We know.
when you see me hold down, I checking for the beads at the top. So,
Yeah, hot. Anyhow,
I got the heating down. I nearly forget to turn off the heating because it's warming up a little
It's
bit.
warm
here,
enough.
but
It's
not
warm
too
enough.
warm yet. It's warm enough. So I good. But this conversation that we're gonna have today, I'm really looking forward to it because I think it's one that ties in to a lot of conversations that are happening in the Caribbean right now regarding reparations as it relates to the transatlantic slave times. And I think it's an apt conversation to have now. And I think even though we talk amongst ourselves as a people, it's always good to get the perspective of others from outside the region as well, who have links to the region through the same transatlantic slave empire as well, and just have a conversation and have a chat. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
So,
You
you
guys think?
said we talk about it among ourselves, but do we really talk about it among ourselves?
Well, when I say that, I
Qualify
mean
we.
officially.
Mhm.
I mean
Okay.
the officials.
Okay.
I mean the officials.
Yeah.
I mean
Yeah,
the
yeah.
officials.
Yeah.
No, I don't think we as a people really think about it that much.
I think we dismiss it
Yeah.
as well as irrelevant. I think the everyday person would dismiss reparations as, that doesn't feel like something that's relevant for us in this day and age.
You think so?
I think so.
It
I think a lot of
depends.
people
They're
would
camps.
I think a lot of people would follow that argument of, yeah, so how much money we need, put a figure on it, that sort of language.
I think
what do you
that
Mark?
I think they're different camps. I think that there are people who are very, very focused on this is a specific issue and what it means for the Caribbean, its history and its future. They're pockets of people, and broadly speaking, they're officials and around the CARICOM table, etc.
Mm.
The average person in the Caribbean, right, who trying to keep the wolves from the door, ain't really too locked into this conversation. They will hear about it, but it's too distant, it's too far, it ain't relatable, even though it's relatable, if you see what I mean. But they just cannot really get into it because there's too many other things that are too important right now.
But I think you're right. I think it's not in frontal
Hmm.
in our thinking at the moment. But I think it is also, as you say, is because we as a people, we just get on with things. We
Get
got too
on.
much other things to deal with that's immediate and that's
Survival,
gonna
man.
impact
Hmm.
my family.
Hmm.
So
Mhm.
the first, and that's true not just only about this conversation. That's true about a lot of things. That's why in the Caribbean that governance and stuff is still relatively lax and all that kind of stuff, because folks, you push those things away as those are for the politicians and different field things
Hmm.
to deal with. How many times you hear you talking to a man and man will tell you, so what I got to do? Tell me how that can
Yeah,
impact
yeah, yeah,
me,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
right? Tell me how that can impact me. Never looking at the wider
No.
picture or what have you. Which is why I'm glad the conversation is being had, because
Mhm.
it's bringing it into the consciousness of
Yeah.
people right
Mhm.
now to have those conversations. And I think I think it was one that was always going to happen, especially when you look at the journey of post-colonialism,
Hmm.
Caribbean, where pre very low educated, right after survival.
Mhm.
We're now setting things in
Yeah.
place as far as education and stuff are
Hmm.
concerned. I'm not surprised the conversations are happening now, a generation and a
Yeah.
half after independence, where the children of those who were part of the independence movement have now benefited from the
Hmm.
education, the wider
Yep.
world, technology, this kind of stuff. And then asking a question
Yeah.
like, hang on, so how it is this never happened,
Mhm.
but this happened?
But but you know,
Whereas our grandparents were too
yeah,
busy
Yeah.
fight,
trying to
Just
trod,
getting
fighting,
things going.
treading
fighting.
water.
Getting
But you
Yeah,
things
know,
going. Yeah.
exactly.
but you know what's really important there in that generation and their consciousness, the recognition that it might not happen in their lifetime. It probably wouldn't, and
Mhm.
how they're
Mm.
hooking a generation that needs to carry that forward is really really important. And that's where some of the
Agreed.
disconnect is really um particularly distressing, because the likes of Sir Hillary and the others on the commission and the
Mm.
politicians and
David
officials,
Commission,
right?
guys in Grenada and stuff. Yeah.
They are the children of, but
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
generation beyond them and behind them that need to be locked into it, because there has to be succession in this particular issue.
Mhm.
I agree. I agree. And as I say, I'm not surprised that that's the generation that has now bring it to the fore and forcibly doing so as
Hmm.
well with confidence.
Yeah.
Because I think, again, immediate post-colonialism, I get my tongue mixed up today, but
Drink some water.
post-colonization, confidence in things by the previous masters. You just didn't
That's
have any
right.
confidence to do that. And you didn't have the education
Mhm.
to
No.
even understand what was going on and what had happened and the severity and
Hmm.
what things meant. The Prime Minister Barbados always speaking about, the non-communicable diseases and stuff that plagues the region right now. You can draw a straight line to that and the transatlantic slave trade
Absolutely.
and the
Absolutely.
diet and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
You can draw a
Stress.
straight line to that.
Yep.
The stress,
Yep.
trauma, the way we raise our children, the
Mhm.
100%.
outlook on life, everything. You could draw a straight line on that, and not to mention the global cultural impact that the transatlantic
Well,
slave trade has had on Black people
you don't even gotta go
globally.
that far. You gotta just look at the trailway.
Well, yeah.
You don't even gotta go that far. The trailway
Yeah.
here in England. Why? You can draw
Yeah.
the line. You can draw that
Exactly.
line back.
You
Yeah.
can
Right?
draw the line right back. So it's an important conversation to have.
Absolutely.
And that's why we have our guest today, Laura Trevelyan. Hopefully, I say that right. I've been practicing all day to
Okay.
get to say to say that. Respected journalist, formerly of the BBC, and someone who's traced her roots and her family tree back to Grenada, and has been really on a journey to understand the part that her family may have played in this, transatlantic slave trade in Grenada. And she's, made some bold moves, and I think it'd be great for us to have a conversation. I'm not going to say anything, let her tell
Yeah.
her story, but I'm really excited to have her in to have that conversation, because I think it's a really important
Yeah, man.
conversation. So without further ado, let's bring Laura in.
Hey,
Hi guys.
how you doing?
Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you all doing? Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's such a pleasure to meet you all, Andre, Philip, and Mark. I've been listening to your chat. I found it very interesting indeed.
Good.
Oh,
You could understand everything.
I was just going to ask. Did you catch everything?
Mostly.
Mostly.
I don't know who Donville is.
Yeah.
I didn't know who Donville was. That was the one bit I got confused about.
Okay.
Oh, that's very local. That's very local.
I bet the journalist in you is already investigating.
Well, I wanted to use my phone to Google it, but I was worried that I would lose the link, so I didn't.
All right.
Don't worry, you will hear a lot more about Donville.
Okay.
You will hear a lot. You will hear a lot. Don't worry
Anyway, it's
about it.
great to
Thank
have you in the living room, Laura. Welcome and thank you so much. And you know, we introduce you, and we're going to have quite a deep conversation around reparations. But let's start first of all with Laura Trevelyan, the BBC journalist and the person who's been on our screens for so long. And tell us a little bit about
Very much so.
that journey and how that all came into being for yourself.
Yeah, so I was with the BBC for 30 years and I left just over 2 weeks ago because I decided, and you might think this sounds a bit unlikely, but we can talk all about it, because I decided that I wanted to join the Caribbean's fight for reparatory justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that might seem an unusual journey. So let me briefly explain why. Around about, I think it was around about 2016 when I found out, but 2013, University College London published this big database called The Legacies of British Slavery. And they actually published the compensation records that were paid to 46,000 different people who filed for compensation when slavery was abolished in 1833. So it might seem unbelievable, but the slave owners were paid compensation by Britain's government when slavery was abolished, because otherwise there would never have been agreement. So actually 40% of Britain's GDP in 1833 was what it cost to pay off the slave owning families. And that included, by the way, the Trevelyan family, who filed for compensation on at least 6 different estates in the island of Grenada. So it turns out that my ancestors owned more than 1,000 slaves at abolition, and they received about £3 million in today's money in compensation for what was termed the loss of their property, because that was how things were seen back there. So this was very shocking to our wider family when somebody typed the name Trevelyan into that online database at some point in the years after it was published. And it sparked a wider debate in our family about what this meant now, because none of us had any idea, nor did the generation above.
And what prompted y'all to do that search in the database?
I think, you know, one of my curious cousins just that, by the way, that database crashed when it was first published by UCL because so many people were typing their names in to find out. And then, one of my cousins who's quite, you know, liberal and, you know, probably politically to the left, and was very concerned. And I guess, I don't know that he suspected. I think he just he was curious. Anyway, so there, it turns out, there it is in black and white, and all the details of, you know, exactly how much you get per enslaved person, which is really grotesque to look at, especially when you think the system looked at this. These were not people; these were property. So this was compensation for the loss of your property. So that set me on a journey thinking about it. Well, actually, first of all, I decided I couldn't think about it because it was too hard to think about, and also I had written a book about my ancestors in 2006, not knowing anything about this. So I felt like, well, this book is completely out of date.
Ask. So usually sometimes we know a little bit about family history and what's not, but it seems like clearly this was never talked about.
No, and actually my family in the 19th century and early 20th was very prominent. My ancestors were administrators in the empire. In India, one of them is a very controversial figure in Ireland, Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan. He was in charge of famine relief during the Irish famine, and he's widely held to be a villain who didn't send enough famine relief to Ireland. But he's also someone who was a reformer. He was a meritocrat. He introduced competitive reforms to the civil service, whereas before, just, you know, if you knew the right people, you could get in. So And then my great-grandfather, George Macaulay Trevelyan, was the best-selling historian in the first half of the 20th century. So his histories of England are very widely taught. And actually, Sir Hilary Beckles, the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, studying in Hull in the 60s, studied George Macaulay Trevelyan. So that's a strange link that we have.
Okay.
So it wasn't, in other words, this sort of vision of family as public servants was very odd.
So before you go too far down that line of helping us to understand the family, I want our audience to understand you, Laura. Okay, because I'm sure a lot of people will watch this and they'll want to understand who's Laura Trevelyan and why how has she arrived at this point. So take us behind the name, take us into your space for a moment and help us to understand you, Laura, and how you got here.
Well, I have been with the BBC for 30 years. So I was a political correspondent in Westminster, a United Nations correspondent. I moved to New York. I was there in 2004, and I've lived here since. And in that role, I've been all over the Caribbean, reporting from Haiti after the earthquake, the cholera epidemic. I've seen just the tragedy that's unfolded there. I've reported from Cuba, and just become very interested in the region in general, I must say. So then when this link with Grenada emerged, I sat on it a bit and thought it was quite complicated. And then in 2020, with the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and so many protests were in New York City. So covering that story and thinking that, well, if one of the legacies of slavery is police brutality against Black men, so what does that mean? What does this mean that we owned slaves? What's the impact on Grenada? What is the legacy? And what is the debate about reparations, which I was beginning to hear about? So then the BBC let me report a documentary about it last year, and I went to Grenada. And then that sort of set me off down this journey, because then I met Ali Gill, the chair of Grenada's Reparations Committee, and the vice chair, Nicole Philip Dow, who I had long discussions with them, and also with Sir Hilary Beckles, the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. And that set me then on a journey, because my BBC commissioning editor said, Laura, you can't go to Grenada and you can't ask the question, should I pay? You can't come back without having asked that question. You've got to pose that question when you're there, or you're not worth the paper you're written on, sort of thing. So I did with these wonderful schoolgirls. Well, everybody I met, I said, what do you think I should do? What do you think our family should do? What do you think it means that we got £3 million in compensation? Having, by the way, owned slaves from about 1750 till abolition. And then, of course, the enslaved didn't get their freedom. As you know, they had to work as apprentices for some years afterwards, because they were not considered capable of living
independent life.
So the degree of exploitation, I mean, who even can say how much money my ancestors made from it? The only hard figure we have is the compensation figure at the end. So I asked everybody I met, what do you think this means? What if any responsibility do you think we have as descendants? And the answer was, yes, you do have responsibility, and yes, you should do something. And look at the legacy of slavery in Grenada today, of legacy of hypertension, diabetes, through poor diet. The fact, as you know so much better than I, that enslavement left a legacy immediately of poverty and illiteracy. And it's only now, these many generations later, that the islands are doing so well, but think how much better they would do if they had proper investment in infrastructure. And so it seemed to me that the CARICOM 10-point reparations plan is extremely logical. First of all, a demand for a request for an apology, because you need to acknowledge the past before you can move on. And then, investment in healthcare, in education, and debt forgiveness. This all seemed very logical to me.
Very logical stuff. Take me back to going to Grenada. How did that make you feel? How was it for you? I know obviously it was eye-opening and what have you as well. And I saw you had spoken to one of your producers who was there whose ancestry was it
Haiti.
Haiti? I think
Haiti.
it was.
Yeah.
As well. But what was it? How was it for you? How did it make you feel emotionally and the connection that you have?
I mean, as the Americans would say, it was a lot for sure. But I was very reassured because I sent an email to Nicole Philip Dow, who's a historian and administrator at the University of the West Indies and vice chair of Grenada's National Reparations Committee. So she was the first person in official Grenada that I reached out to. And I sent her an email to say, oh, Nicole, I'd really like to chat because, my ancestors owned slaves in Grenada. And then I pressed send thinking, oops, I wonder what she's going to say. Oh, and then she wrote back almost straight away saying, Laura, I've got a big smile on my face. It's Laura Trevelyan of BBC World. Of course you can come. Where have you been? Let's talk. So the fact that Nicole was so enthusiastic and not hostile and not critical, or that she just was pleased, because Grenada was actually the last island in the Caribbean to set up a reparations committee. CARICOM in 2014 agreed their 10-point plan, but Grenada was the last island, I guess because it's much smaller, and Jamaica has really led the movement.
Yeah. So tell us a bit then about the emotions of that journey, because as that piece is unfolding as you're in Grenada, I can only imagine that there's some emotions that are starting to stir within you.
Yes, well, I
Talk
went
to us
with
about
a wonderful young producer, Coralie Barreau, who, as you were saying there, Coralie's Haitian American, and she's in her 20s, so she's nearly 30 years younger than me, and for her it was also very emotional. So Nicole took us to one of the old sugarcane estates, which is now, by the way, thriving tourist industry there. Wonderful place to go for lunch and buy chocolate, but you can still see the artifacts. You can see the bells, the slave bell. You can see the old abandoned sugar mills. You can see the coppers where the sugar was made. So there's these places are eerie. And Nicole showed us all the instruments of torture there on the Belmont estate. She brought them from Grenada's National Museum. So she showed us the whips that we've used on slaves. She showed us these shackles, including the shackles for children that a blacksmith had made for children, which Coralie and I was just even more horrified by those. And Coralie kept touching them and saying, this could have been me. This is what she was feeling, because her ancestors were enslaved in Haiti. And then also the worst bit was the neck brace that Nicole showed us, this neck brace that was used as a form of punishment. So I found to be really horrifying, and also just the cognitive dissonance a bit, because the Trevelyans were absentee slave owners, as so many people were. They had an agent on the island, and they just sat
So your family never lived on the island?
They didn't live in Grenada. As far as I know, they never stepped foot in Grenada. They had an agent on the island, a Mr. Hankey. He actually had a slave ship that came from West Africa that was called the Hankey. So he was all in, and he actually became an adopted brother, in fact. So obviously they're very close to him. He's adopted family, but he's the one that's doing all the work, as it were. And the checks are just rolling in from the sale of sugar. And then when abolition comes around, they're filing their compensation claims, but they never confront any of it. And yet the horror of slavery was well known. There were debates in Parliament. I mean, so I just found it so strange to think, how could they have lived with it?
But isn't that one of the things, though, that people talk about, the disconnect that British people have with what was happening in the Caribbean and in the Americas as well? So even today, the British public seem to have a real disconnection with the slave trade, and wonder what all this talk is about, because they just don't can't associate with it because it was happening over there.
Well, I don't know what all of you think about the Guardian this week published their investigation showing that when the Guardian newspaper was set up, that of their 11 backers, various of them had links to the slave trade, either because they were cotton merchants, because all of the cotton was shipped from America. I mean, remember, American slavery was British slavery until the Americans became independent in 1776.
And that's the point that I think people in Britain disconnect from as well.
Yeah, but it was originally
British slavery.
Yeah, the slave ships took the slaves to Virginia in the US and to the Caribbean. Yeah, they just had different destinations, but it was all British.
It is.
America was another colony. So, there are many disconnects. And certainly at school, I was taught that Britain abolished slavery, that William Wilberforce was a very important figure, but not that we'd participated in it very heavily. That bit was missing.
Yeah.
Well,
Another disconnect.
there's a real consciousness that needs to awaken within a lot of institutions in Britain when it comes to their history. It's very convenient how these conversations never come onto the table. And I'm sure over the years you would have, interacted with many institutions who have got the same legacy as the Guardian and many others, but there is no coming forward with conversation to help to address this problem. Do you think that your step at the moment is quite a defining one that's going to start to make a lot of these institutions ask questions of themselves?
Well, that's what I hope. So, because the end of February, I went to Grenada with 7 family members, and Nicole Philip Dow, who I was telling you about, of Grenada's National Reparations Committee, Arlie Gill, and the Prime Minister of Grenada, Dickon Mitchell, held a public forum, and we read out our letter of apology to the people of Grenada for what our ancestors did to theirs. And we announced that as a family, we're giving more than £100,000 to essentially to education projects in Grenada through the University of the West Indies, and with the government of Grenada, they'll decide how the money is spent. And that's what we had.
How was it received?
As well, I mean, I would say there were a lot of emotions. That it was really something, that it was a packed room, there may be 200 people. And Grenada's National Museum, the director, Angus Martin, had arranged this very powerful art installation at the back of chains, hanging chains, to obviously to represent the chains of enslavement. And then on the chains were hooks with the names of all of the enslaved that had been owned by our family at abolition and the ages. So we were reading all the names. And my stepmother, who was there, who's called Julia, and she's 68, she read one of the cards and it said Julia, age 67. And she was just blown away by the idea that, because the idea of that installation was, of course, for people to be able to visualize and imagine who these individuals were. So,
and create a connection as well, because some people there would be feeling, actually, these are some of our ancestors. They could be people who are actually descendants of people named there as well.
Exactly, and the estates that they were on. And we read in our letter, we read out the names of all of the estates, and there were actually 10 in the end that we were associated with at various times. So our ancestors didn't claim for compensation for all of them, because some of them they'd sold, I think, at some point. So, and afterwards, people came up to me and said, "Oh, St. Cloud, that's where my dad's family are from." That means that maybe your ancestors own mine, not in a hostile way, but just in a, thank you for the connection.
It's quite a moment.
A lot of people said, "Thank you for what you've done. This is brave. And thank you for being part of our history and showing up." But other people were like, "This isn't very much money, is it? What's this going to do? How's it going to help me?"
But hang on.
Make yourselves feel better.
Go back a step, actually, because tell us about the actual decision to get to the letter. The journey of you coming back and having to have conversation with the family and guys.
Yeah, and the conversations.
What were the conversations? How did that play out?
That's a great question. So after I made the documentary last year, that sparked a debate within family. And the cousin I was telling you about, John Dower, who's the one who did the Googling of the database originally. And John, by the way, he said that discovery he said his world fell apart, which is, this is not how I felt, by the way. As a journalist, I was like, well, what's the story here? What is the world?
Okay.
But for him, he's very idealistic, much more so than me, and much more politically engaged, I think, and he was just horrified. So he then, when the documentary came out, he worked really hard to convene family and say, I think we should have a discussion. What are we going to do? Laura's gone. She's gone to Grenada. She's found out there's this whole debate about reparations. And, the first point on the reparations plan is an apology. So let's talk about this. And he got together, 40, 50. Can you imagine 40, 50 people on a Zoom, complete chaos.
And were they all feeling the same emotion about it?
Well, no.
Families are very different, Laura. You know what it's like. There's some members of the
Mm.
family who are going to be in completely different camps.
Exactly. No, it's like herding cats. So broadly speaking, the family fell into the camp of you cannot apologize philosophically for something you didn't do.
Mhm.
You just can't. So there were those people. Then there were this was hundreds of years ago, nothing to do with me. I don't have any money. I haven't been affected by this. This is all just woke nonsense kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people who are like, well, no, we have a responsibility to do something. And so it's kind of all over the shop, really. But then it began to move towards a sort of, we should draft a letter of apology for those who feel that way. But then what was really pivotal was I asked Sir Hilary Beckles if he would come and address the group. So he did last July. So Sir Hilary Beckles.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay.
And this, this book, which by the way, I think is brilliant, his Britain's Black Debt, such a powerful, powerful making of the case for reparations. And I think that you were saying a little bit earlier, Mark, and I think this is true, that it's taken until this generation of very confident intellectual Caribbean leaders to really forcefully make the case. Anyway, so Sir Hilary Beckles, an eminent chap, if ever there was one, comes and joins our Zoom. And he was so, he's very eloquent, as you know, but he was also just really friendly and measured and calm. And he just made the case for an apology and for reparations. And he said things like, people in the Caribbean, their history is a void. We don't know where we came from. You know who you are. You know where you came from. But all we know is that vaguely we came from West Africa. Our ancestors were kidnapped and they were dumped in the Caribbean. And that void is painful. And if you can come forward as a family and fill in some of the gaps, that will be very meaningful. And it will also set an example to other families. It will be symbolic, hugely symbolic, and it will be historic. He said, you can't underestimate the significance of this moment. And this was in July. So it was before the Dutch government apologised for slavery in December, before the church commissioners and the Church of England apologised and set up a reparations fund. But Sir Hilary said, this is really something you should do. And he explained how, as a child in Barbados, I know all of you are Barbadian, growing up, he was fed sugar. He took sugar.
Man, I spent many a day in the sugarcane fields, Laura. I'm sure we all have. Paying for it now. Yeah.
Did you eat a lot of sugar as children?
Absolutely. Well, we still
Of
do.
course.
We still do.
That's very
it's not very surprising there's an epidemic of obesity, hypertension, diabetes in the Caribbean, is it?
Yeah, but that's why most of the snacks that we had back in the day, they're all like concentrated sugar. Literally concentrated sugar.
It's poisonous.
That's all of our sweets. Sugar cake is literally the name. The clues in the name. It's sugar cake.
It's like a national dish.
Just coconut laden with sugar.
Yeah.
Well, we were all rather ignorant of this, and so Sir Hilary made the case very powerfully, and he changed so many minds. So people who'd been saying before, "Oh, I don't think I can apologise for something I didn't do," realised the value. And were convinced by him. And then by the time we got to Grenada, we had 104 people signed the letter.
Well, that's great. Now, families is one thing, and they're hard to convince as well. But social structures, and people that you consider your friends and extended family, and what have you. What were those conversations like as well?
Well, I have to say that bit I'm probably only just beginning with. Now that and I have, I've had various black friends in Britain send me notes saying, Laura, I don't really approve of this reparation stuff. I can't wait to see you to talk about it.
Okay.
It's our 25th wedding anniversary in July. And my husband and I are going to be back we're going to have a party in London, so we'll be hearing from those friends then. But I was in London last week because having various meetings, I met Clive Lewis, the MP, the Labour MP, because he stood up in Parliament on the day that our family apologised, actually, because his dad's Grenadian, so he's of Grenadian descent. Yeah. And Clive said in Parliament, if the Trevelyan family can apologise and pay reparations, then why can't Britain's government? And called on Britain's government to,
But why do you think Britain's government is reluctant to apologise?
Well, I think the reason that successive British governments, and it's not confined to conservative ones, and the royal family have said that they regret that slavery happened and that it was abhorrent, but haven't apologised, is clearly they think there's a legal issue that if you apologise, then you've said you're responsible, and therefore you must be
open the floodgates.
you must be liable for paying some kind of compensation. I assume that this must be why they haven't. But you can see that everything is changing. And you were talking about the Chinese in your setup chat beforehand. Chinese building stadiums. Yeah. But I think it hasn't gone unnoticed, has it, that the Chinese are investing really heavily in infrastructure in the Caribbean,
right
and
through the Caribbean
road initiative, and that this is giving China a strategic advantage in a region that really should be pro-Western and that is full of democracies. So, you know, why is the West giving China this advantage? And anyway, so many things happening. But yeah, probably you know about Dennis O'Brien's repair campaign. Do you know about that?
I've heard about it, but not a full
So you know
extent.
Dennis O'Brien of Digicel, the phone company.
Oh yes,
The Irish business,
the Irish,
and he's worked in the Caribbean for 30 years. But he's just set up something called the Repair Campaign, where he wants to repair the damage done by slavery, specifically through getting lobbying for CARICOM's 10-point reparations plan. And he's working with the University of the West Indies and CARICOM to turn the 10-point reparation plan into specific country-by-country plans. So what does this mean? You know, what investment is needed in education and healthcare? So he's doing all of that work with CARICOM and the University of the West Indies.
So you're starting to create.
Then he's going to start lobbying, European governments.
So do you find you're starting to create a bit of a network of people such as Dennis and so on?
There are things happening, you know, as a journalist, I can see all of this stuff happening. And I think the Dutch government apologising for slavery in December and setting up a reparations fund, although it was criticised as inadequate at the time, nonetheless, it's huge that they actually apologised. Because they're no longer resisting. And, you know, you have the coronation of the king in May, and the king has said, this is a conversation whose time has come, meaning Britain's links to slavery. And what that means specifically for the royal family, because as you know, the royal family chartered the Royal Africa Company, those ships that brought the enslaved from West Africa to the Caribbean. That was the Duke of York, who became King James II, and the enslaved were branded with his initials, DY. So this is a descendant, an ancestor of King Charles.
Yeah, direct line. That's the thing. That lots of direct line.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. Right. It's fine. No, you go ahead.
No, I was gonna say there will be some, and I've seen some reports based on after your step and your family step that would say, man, this is a whole lot of woke nonsense and virtue singling. Do we go to the Vikings and ask them for reparations as well, for way back when? What do you say to that?
Well, I think the point is that all of the wealth left the Caribbean. It was a system of wealth extraction. I mean, this is the case that Sir Hilary makes so powerfully in his books. And then at emancipation, the Caribbean islands were left with literally nothing except for a legacy of poverty and illiteracy. And all of that wealth was in Britain and was used to kickstart the Industrial Revolution. So Britain's prosperity today, and this is the point The Guardian has been making with its series this week, you know, Britain's prosperity is to some degree built from slavery.
Absolutely.
And so
but it is.
A very massive extent.
And
a debt to be repaid. And the fact that it's 180 years later, you know, in some ways, as the past recedes, it comes into focus more sharply.
I think the way how you said 180 years later, yes, I think that's the part of the issue. People fixating with when the abolition of slavery and not seeing colonization and everything that happened right up until the 1960s and 70s. And then the cultural impact of the United States and their brand of Jim Crowism and what have you, that's impacted Black people falling all the way till today. And I think that's where people try to separate things. Like people say slavery 180 years ago and then 300 years before that. How far?
Well, the other point is we try to think that 180 years ago is that long.
It's a long time.
But relationally, both of my grandmothers they knew their grandparents.
Mhm.
Their grandparents were enslaved people.
This
And
is
I
what
knew-
Sir Hilary
And I knew
Beckles
both of my grandparents.
told.
And they could
Right.
tell me stories of their grandparents who
Same thing with my
who
grandmother.
came
yeah.
out of slavery. Yeah.
Right. So this is what Sir Hilary Beckles told us, and our jaws really hit the floor. He said, slavery is not the past, it's the living present. It's within living memory.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
But let me ask you a question, Laura, because there will be some people who will say, when you look at your case where CARICOM has been really lobbying for, a region to region reparation almost, is there a danger that we start to see a family to nation type approach to reparations and it potentially damages the region to region reparation that needs to happen?
Hopefully not. Hopefully, if institutions like the Church of England and families like mine, and by the way, I've heard from quite a few others since our apology, of other people saying, what was the roadmap that you used and how could we go down this? Families with who were previously slave owners, or their ancestors were in Jamaica and Barbados particularly. Hopefully it just builds momentum, I think, because the amount of, let's see what the figures are that come out of the work that the Repair Campaign is doing with CARICOM and the University of the West Indies. But let's say, like Grenada, what are the figures from Grenada? What is the amount of investment that Grenada would want in its healthcare and its education system and debt forgiveness? Like, what are the numbers? And are they ones that can be lobbied and that hopefully future governments can agree to?
Interesting. Okay.
At the moment, it's a bit abstract, isn't it? We don't know what the numbers are.
Are the numbers that important? Because I was thinking about it. The word reparations has a lot to do with healing, and there's that restorative part of it. So the money isn't really the actual big issue, and a lot of people get hung up on the figure. What's the check? What's the check look like? But it is really something about the relational healing as well that needs to be in place, not just between the descendants of the enslaved and descendants of the enslavers, but also between the people themselves as well. There's that, and their nation. So is there that awareness in the conversation that this is not just about money, but this is actually about healing?
For sure. And that's why the first point 1 on the CARICOM 10-point plan is an apology. And that was actually in the best aspect for me of going to Grenada was the reaction that people had to the fact that we were apologizing for what our ancestors had done to theirs. And one woman came up to me and said, I feel like a burden that I didn't even know that I was carrying has been lifted because there was a part of me that was missing, and that's represented by you. And I just want to thank you. So I think that you're right. In intangible ways, there's a healing process.
But do you think I think a lot of people are afraid to go on that journey of healing, actually, because of the potential shame and guilt that might overcome them.
What will it open up?
And a realization. And I think a lot of people just don't want to deal with that.
For sure. I mean, but I think as it is further away, it also
diminishes.
But you can also see the impact more clearly. Yeah. I don't, but I've been encouraged by the reaction that I've had from families who feel that, it's all right. Nothing terrible happened to us. We survived, and like Sir Hilary said, there's you can lead by example and you can show that there's an importance to apologizing. And
so when you talk about intangibles, there's been a lot in the media around the £100,000 that the family has given to the university and so forth. Tell us a bit about the intangibles that people perhaps don't know about, but are things that will happen in support.
Well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. So one of the other aspects of CARICOM's reparations plan is, cultural heritage. The fact that there aren't the fantastic museums that there should be in the Caribbean about the history and the culture. I mean, look at Britain. Look how many incredible museums there are.
True.
And Grenada's National Museum has been closed for a while because of a termite issue, but it's just reopening this spring. And that installation that I was describing to you, that was there when on the day of our apology, that's going to be in the museum. But Grenada's National Museum and Library really could do with proper funding. And it's something that I've been thinking about and talking to Grenadian contacts in New York about. Could the diaspora get behind that? So is there an intangible that comes out of this, which is that there's a proper campaign for Grenada to have maybe Lewis Hamilton could help fund it. Famous Grenadian.
I'm sure.
Maybe you guys can get him on.
We'll try.
But
do you have his number?
But,
do you have a contact?
Yes, but maybe that's another thing that I'm really interested in banging the drum for and talking about the importance of, is for Caribbean islands to have world-class museums that the visitors will want to go to. I mean, I feel like people said to me in Grenada, we don't like to talk about slavery because we make we make money from tourism. We don't want to put people off coming here. We want them to have fun. And I said, I don't think it's going to put the people off. I think tourists would love to go to a museum and learn about the history.
But isn't that so I'm a bit skeptic about some of that, only from the viewpoint in that, not that need for museums. I 100% agree with that. But the assistance coming from outside, I think that there's a orchestrated reason why it doesn't, because it's then reminding and teaching about what actually happened.
Or you think is reinforcing that power dynamic in a sense?
Of course. And I think the danger, one of the things I'm looking at is what's happening in Florida at the moment with Ron DeSantis and his whole war and wokeism and what have you, and some of the books and what's not that he's taken out of schools and teaching Americans about their real history. And I have a fear that that's something that can that can happen here. I'm just looking at the UK for now. I know you can look at the other European countries as well, but I'm looking at the UK at the moment. And the reason being because I think there is already that disconnect with the transatlantic slave trade. And I think one of the reasons why the government here is getting away with just kicking it down the long grass and just saying we regret is because people just don't think about it. It's not in the consciousness of the average British person, and there's no pressure, despite the slavery museum in is it Liverpool?
Liverpool, yeah.
It's one of the
and stuff that in Liverpool that's there. I just think that there is that huge disconnect, and until there's a connection, there wouldn't be that pressure from the people themselves. So every time it comes up, you get a whole bunch of people on, not the BBC, but some of these newer try to be Fox News type things here in the UK, talking about virtue signaling and wokeism, and that was a long time ago. And then they trudge out some black person who's going to argue that point as well. Yes, I agree. We are not victims. This is all us then, and all that kind of stuff. Until there's that connection, I don't think you would see a rush of European countries trying to fund things like museums, which is unfortunate. But I don't think,
in a way, I think I return to your very well made point at the beginning, that it's Grenada. It's nearly 50 years since independence. That as countries grow into their independence, become more confident, as you have intellectuals like Sir Hilary Beckles who see the past more clearly and make the case for reparations more actively. I think, this year is 190 years since abolition. So the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slavery will be 2033. And just like in 2007, which was the abolition of the slave trade, the 200th anniversary, which was a big moment to commemorate, I think the 200th anniversary of abolition, if the conversation begins now and it builds and it grows and it spreads and the lobbying gets underway, that maybe before then, this is something that could be achieved. And I think it would be very interesting to see what the King of England says. He's told his goddaughter, Fiona Compton, who's from St. Lucia, that he's got something he wants to say about the royal family's links to slavery. And I think whatever he has to say will be influential, because he's someone who what he said on the environment years ago. He was way ahead of his time.
What conversation?
But there seemed to be an effort to keep him quiet now these days, though. So I wonder what it is he's going to say, if he's going to be allowed to say it, and at what event is he going to say what he wants
Let's
to say.
wait and see.
I was just wondering about, you have. I'm not prying into your personal business here, but do you have children?
Yes, 3.
Right,
Three boys.
Right. Okay. And
Like you 3.
yeah. Very good.
3 boys. Wow.
So what sort of conversations do you have with them about reparations and what you're doing and your choices and their legacy as well?
Yeah, no, we've talked about it a lot. I mean, of course, they're American, and so and they've grown up in the, they're in their early 20s, and one's a teenager, so 2 in college and 1 at school. So they've come of age, I guess, during a very heated debate in America.
That's right.
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter. And so they've given me very strict instructions that I am not to talk on their behalf. And I will say that yes, basically they're very big on their right to privacy.
Okay.
That's so they should be.
No, I appreciate that, and they should be.
I think, without giving too much away, I think I will say that at the beginning of it, they were pretty skeptical, and they're big into the language of white savior, white privilege, blah blah, all of that.
Yeah.
And I think my youngest son at one point said, no, actually, I'm not going to say what he said. He'll be furious. No, basically,
he'll be furious. Don't
do it.
Don't get in trouble in our
I need to respect. I mean, my view of these things is that all life is copy, but that is not their view. They're like, no, Mum, this is your journey. You go on it, and don't drag us.
He's probably saying, Mum, I said it off
no,
the record.
Exactly.
Off the
it's
record.
pretty much like that. Exactly, Mum. That was not deep background. That was entirely off the record. So,
well, let me ask you something.
See, they know you
Something
well.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah.
You've mentioned Sir Hillary on quite a few occasions throughout the conversation, and there must have been other people who have also been, surrounding yourself with advice, and you talked about a roadmap, and it would be good to understand how those people help you to almost define the roadmap that is now potentially going to be quite influential for others who might be giving consideration to a similar journey.
Yes, well, in fact, I talked to a family whose ancestors were slave owners in Jamaica, and they said, well, how did you do this? And I said, well, the first thing that I did was to contact Nicole Phillip Dow of Grenada's National Reparations Committee. And Nicole has been hugely influential in this. She's actually just written a children's history of Grenada, which is being published by HarperCollins and will be on the curriculum in Grenadian schools.
Wow. That's brilliant.
Quite soon. And she's a really, I mean, this will be familiar to you. She's a strong Caribbean woman of faith.
We're very familiar with that.
Yeah, we're very, exactly. She's
very, very much
You wouldn't want to mess with her. On the morning of our family, Nicole was introducing us at the Trade Centre in Grenada's capital, St George's, on the 27th of February. And there was a protest outside. A Rastafarian group were protesting because they thought this apology was just inadequate and not needed. Not the right response. And my dad said, said to Nicole, well, what's going to happen if there's a bit of a ruckus inside? Like, who's going to be in charge of the proceedings? And Nicole said, I am. And in this way, she just gave him this look like,
don't worry about it, I got it covered.
Don't worry.
I've got this, and shut my dad up. And she's definitely formidable, but she's incredibly kind and thoughtful, and worked really hard to help me set up the BBC documentary, to make sure that we went to speak to schoolgirls, which was fascinating. I talked to the girls about the legacy of slavery, and they told me about colorism, about discipline, harsh discipline that their parents in particular were subjected to. They talked to me about the slave mentality that they described as being prevalent. It was just really so interesting. These 15, 16-year-old girls, just brilliant and so knowledgeable.
It's fascinating that children at that age, in this generation, have those perspectives.
Yeah.
I don't think, thinking back to my time when I was a teenager, I don't think we would have had as clear a perception and opinion about the impact of slavery on us. I think we were still in a stage of trying to piece it together, but maybe it's
Right.
because of different access to information and insight and different conversations at our time as well.
Their world is very different.
But it is fascinating how that shift has occurred.
And do you think that's a
I
good
wonder.
thing?
I think
No,
it's
go
a
ahead.
great thing. I think it's a really great thing that children that age are able to be so introspective and aware. You know, I've been listening to this book called When the Body Says No, and Mark and Andre and I've been talking about it a lot. And it's really a book about
Tad.
it's by a guy called Gabor Mate, and then he's written a recent book called The Myth of Normal, which I need to get. But he talks a lot about the links between stress and trauma and non-communicable disease, and how we're now really starting to understand those links. One of the important aspects of it was this journey of healing, which is the 7 A's. And the first is acceptance, and the second is awareness. So acceptance of self and awareness of situation and possibilities is like that second stage of healing. That's why I was trying to liken, well, reparations is a form of healing. So you could actually
Means
look
to
at those.
repair.
Yeah,
it's for
you
the
could actually look
best
at those 7 steps as part of that. And the first is that acceptance and apology as well. Acceptance that this is really a thing, right? That has an impact on who we are, how we behave, our relationships, our goals, our mindset, our behaviors, our emotions, our diseases. There's having that acceptance, and then the awareness of our current situation and potential things that we could do. The third is my favorite. The third is anger. And anger seems like a dangerous word, but the way he frames it is there are 2 types of unhealthy anger. There's rage, which is unhealthy, and there's repression, which is unhealthy as well. So the healthy anger is that one that actually leads you to a slow, regulated release of anger. And I think when it comes to slavery, there's either been rage, which is unhealthy, or repression, where people try to suppress it and dismiss it and say, this has happened years ago. We're over it. Time to move on.
Yeah.
Ignore all the sort of residual aspects of life that are still there. But we do need to go through that process of having healthy anger about our situation, our relationships, and all the sort of effects that have been there.
Laura, you spoke a bit about the reactions you got, mixed reactions from various groups of people. And I want to say predominantly what I'm hearing is most of them seem to be Black people in Grenada. I wonder what the descendants of plantocracy, if you've had any conversations with like the white inhabitants of, say, Grenada, has any of them reached out to you at all, and what those conversations are like?
No, not in Grenada. No, I mean, I've had families who are descendants who are in Britain now, you know, whose families were slave owners in Barbados and Jamaica. So I've had that kind of person reach out to me. No, but not those who
not still living on the islands.
No, not people who are still living on the island, still owning estates. No, haven't had any contact with anyone like that.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
Well,
I'd venture to say you might not get any.
I was about to. Well, yeah. I mean,
You
It
might
might sound more controversial by saying that.
yes, but you can imagine why that people might feel more exposed in that position.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the journey with CARICOM, because clearly, you know, we've talked about the points on the plan, and how do you see yourself in your actions and the role that you want to play moving forward, enhancing the CARICOM journey? How do you see that moving forward?
Well, so one of the things that I'm hoping is that the work that the Repair Campaign are doing with the University of the West Indies and CARICOM to actually come up with, in a sense, specific plans for each island with regard to reparations, what that looks like, what the numbers are, what the ask is, and then that's going to go out to the European Union and to Britain, and the lobbying will begin. So I hope that I can be part of that campaign with the voice of a descendant of slave owners. And so Hilary Beckles has encouraged me to think of myself as someone who could be a bridge between the Caribbean and Britain because of my heritage. And, you know, I was a political correspondent in Westminster. I was a United Nations correspondent. I have quite a lot of experience of diplomacy and politics, not as an advocate, but as certainly as someone who covers those things. And Sir Hilary said, you know, Laura, you're a gifted communicator and you should do something with that. So I don't know that I had thought of myself like that really, but it's strange when someone else sees a role for you and then you begin to think of it yourself and think of yourself in a different way. Yeah. So I'm hoping
do you think that you might be challenged as Laura Trevelyan without the BBC brand?
For sure.
I was just going
Becoming
to ask
that bridge.
but go ahead.
I have a follow-up question for
challenge or free. Which one you mean?
I think it's quite,
I would think freed
well,
is the way how I would put
I think
it.
it's quite freeing. The thing about, you know, 30 years.
That was my second question, actually.
BBC News. Yeah. The thing about working for BBC News is that you do the impossible on a daily basis. You run around with your hair on fire. You know, I was presenting a daily program where every day at 5 o'clock, no matter what, we have to be ready. We have to have, I've written all my scripts. I have to think about my interviews. I have to be able to go live. I have to be across everything that's happening. And quite often I have to be across stuff that's changing while we're on the air. You know, I've presented live in hurricanes, presented in all kinds of wild conditions. And it is a good training in public speaking and in thinking on your feet and in absorbing complicated information and then communicating it to a broad audience. Yeah. And I hope, because as you've been saying, you know, this is quite a complicated argument in some ways, but in other ways, it's quite simple. You know,
it is, yeah. But other people might say reparations is also a kind of politicized and political topic. No, this is where it comes back to the BBC, where the BBC's emphasis is impartiality, and therefore touching politicized topics is maybe a bit off the cards. Do you think that there might, Andre used the word freed there, but do you think there might have been challenges there had you continued with the BBC and execute at the same scale that you want?
Well, I think in the end I just wasn't going to be able to. I realized that, you know, making the documentary was one thing. The BBC was very keen on that. But then I began to get, after the family apology, I began to get all these requests to speak and write and broadcast.
Right, so it's more a matter of being able to scale and having the capacity.
And it was just, you know, I was coming up against the line of, you know, I was asked to write a piece for the Radio Times and I had to get it vetted, of course, by the BBC about the King and slavery. And so, you know, I couldn't say what I wanted to really say, which was, I hope the King can follow in the footsteps of our family and apologise for the royals' links to slavery. I couldn't say that. It's too sensitive. You know, the BBC is broadcasting the King's coronation to the world in 6 weeks' time. So to your point about being freed.
You'd be under the same pressure as Gary Lineker, I think. Said that.
Oh dear.
Right, well, I just wasn't going to be able to. But I also think that this is a story that needs to be told. And I don't think of it, although obviously it is political, but I don't think of it as being political. To me, it's a justice. It's a question of justice. It's not a left, right, or a black, white issue. It's justice for the Caribbean, which is overdue. And to me, that's simple. And it's not political. It's just a question of telling that story.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think where people might see it crossed in the line of political is where they might see a perceived bias towards one group to tell their story in full and have no issue with that, but then have an issue telling this story in full because there's an impact on you and you refuse to touch that for whatever reason. All of a sudden, that's political, but this one isn't. This one is humanity and humane, and I think that's the issue that I think you get, even with perhaps even people in the Caribbean that might have a little bit of pushback or questioning your motives or what have you, or the amount of you're doing and whether it's needed now. I think there's a little bit of a mistrust, and hey, we've gotten this far without the royal you, not saying you yourself, I mean in general, and we've just had to do it. You know, X wasn't trustworthy. You've never wanted to tell our story. Why should we believe you now? Kind of thing. I think even within the Caribbean, the conversations around reparations, I think you might have heard us saying at the beginning that it's not necessarily in the frightened consciousness of everyone. And some of it is that. Some of it is like, we're tired of having these conversations. Sometimes you have them, the trust wasn't there. Why should we trust you now? Let's just move on. So there's some of that, the dichotomy of thought as well within the Caribbean also, which is understandable,
For sure.
I think.
I mean, why would you trust anything the British say? It would be,
because if you're not going to tell the story in full,
Yeah.
you're telling, if you just say something is regrettable,
Yeah.
we know it's regrettable. Why
Yeah.
go the next step now? The next step is really it's something from the heart. That's a political statement. Show that you mean something, and I think that's where you get the issue and the pushback and the hey, we
Absolutely.
can't trust you.
What's the time scale for the repair project?
well, they're working now with the University of the West Indies and CARICOM, and I think the hope is that specific island by island plans are completed by the summer and then ready by the fall. There's, lobbying hopefully begins of the European Union and the United Kingdom. And I know that Clive Lewis has been also talking to the repair campaign. There is an all-party parliamentary group on reparations. So there's a role that the all-party parliamentary group could play. And I sense that in Britain, having been in London, well, you're there, but there's just so, I went on to LBC, that I've just had so many interview requests on this and so much newspaper interest. And it just feels like there's a discussion that's underway. I don't know if you think that's the case.
I think there probably is, but there's probably a role for the diaspora. Andrea's word. there's a role for the diaspora across Britain, but I don't know if it has been well enough defined to help us to move the conversation on in Britain. It feels a little bit far off over there somewhere happening to us, as opposed to us being in the conversation, helping to drive that dialogue forward.
Do you think if you had, if you knew what Barbados's ask was for reparations, do you think that's something that the diaspora in Britain, that the diaspora would want to get involved in lobbying for?
That's a hard one.
I think a lot of people it's a hard one, only because, as I say, it's really not at the frontal thoughts of people. Survival is, kids through university is. We're the kind of people that will often ask the question, okay, how does that impact me, and meaning me personally? Unfortunately, not necessarily look at the wider picture, although more and more people are beginning to do that now. I think there's also a view, perhaps even here, that there's a lot of conversations that the diaspora was having here and ask about treatment, perception, being involved in conversations, all falling on deaf ears. So I think there's also that view again of trust. Like, why
also, I do
kind of
think the diaspora here in the UK is starting to lose that connection to the Caribbean as the generations move on as well.
Very true.
So that when it comes to challenges that Black people and African Caribbean people have here, it's all localized. It's all about the local challenges people have.
Very important.
The furthest back people would go is the Windrush generation, and the Windrush generation is not really it's a Caribbean story, but it's a Caribbean story that played out in the UK, and that sets the context for people. If people think of reparations, they might look at it within that context, as opposed to the more historical links. So I think there is that challenge of connection and people still feeling invested in the Caribbean.
But there's a great opportunity, though. There's a great opportunity to refresh the thinking around how we need to move forward in what feels as though this period that we're in could be quite a defining moment with the steps that you've taken, Sir Hillary and the movement, and the wave that's coming. We've got to seize that opportunity to reset it as the Windrush generation gets smaller. The focus to back home becomes a little bit distant for some people. We have to reset this, otherwise it's going to go away from us. So I think to answer your question, once we could see what the arts look like and we are able to participate, I'm sure we would want to be able to lend our voices in any way that we can. And not just our voices, but our voices and the actions that are needed.
But you make a really good point, though, about the challenges that Black people in Britain face every day. And as the links to the Caribbean become more distant, what do you think the conversation should be in Britain about the legacy of slavery and its impact on Black people today in Britain?
I think first there has to be that step of awareness that they are related to each other. And I think quite often when you talk about racism within Britain, you'd have people that say, "Oh, I don't see skin color," and so on. And you have to move past and say, this is not just about the color of people's skin. This is the perception of hierarchy as a result of people's appearance, and so on. And that happens. And this is actually linked to slavery. I think we sometimes separate the conversation of racism and slavery as two different things. But racism was created by slavery. This particular configuration of racism was actually created by a very intentional effort to create that distinction between
hierarchy of
black
human
and white,
beings.
that hierarchy of human beings, so that the slave trade could be sustained. And I think when people start to recognize how deeply connected and intertwined their experience of racism, whether it's perceptual that they have, or it's based on imagery that they see and so on, is so linked to slavery, and that is actually the foundation of what people experience today. I think there's a mindset shift, and it goes back to reparations, because it is repairing that perception of each other and that perception of self as well is the journey that we have to go on collectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's profound, isn't it? And do you think if the king, if he was to apologize for the royal family's role in slavery, that there would be some healing power to that in Britain?
Massive.
In Britain, yes, because and not just by the diaspora. I mean, in general, for Britain, everybody. Because as I say, there is something to do with that linkage. Philip talk about the linkage between the diaspora here, slavery, and when the Windrush generation, people losing that link. But I still contend that until someone like the king or the prime minister or someone like that actually apologizes, there'd be a lot of people that still don't necessarily see that link between Britain and the slave trade. Yeah. I still think it's that. I still think there's so many people, because it happened over there, they never saw it. Generations of people here never saw or heard anything that was happening other than, hey, we are on this big adventure around the world and all these great and wonderful and exotic things are coming back to us. The how was never discussed or talked about.
Yeah.
And that's and even today, it's still, my daughter does history. Even today, secondary school, still never really talked about other than a couple pages in a book. This happened, move on. Industrial Revolution, and we all became great, wonderful, and internet technology and that kind of stuff. The how is never really discussed.
When we had Michael Holland on the show a few months ago, Michael was very, very clear. History is told by the conqueror, and that's what we've been having to live with throughout our Caribbean existence. I think if the king makes a statement, it has to be very well considered. It has to be genuine. William in Jamaica last year was a real disaster, and you got to be very careful once you step into that realm of wanting to say sorry. It has to be done the right way. The language has to be right, and it has to be authentic. Otherwise, you probably end up doing the wrong thing when you're trying to do the right thing. So it would probably be the right step at the top of the British institution, but
Yeah.
it's got to be really done the right way.
I think people underestimate the power of apologies,
Mhm.
and they sort of think, oh, apologies are just words. But let me create this scenario. Let's say you're walking on the street and you step on someone's toe, right? And you just look back at them and you walk on. What's the message that you're giving?
Mhm.
The message you're given is
So what?
you don't matter. Right? So what? I stepped on your toe. I have
Mm.
I have more important things to do now than to recognize your humanity and your pain. I need to get across the road. Whereas versus if you stop and say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to take the time out of my rush and my journey to turn to see you in your eyes, recognize your humanity, and say I'm sorry for the pain that I've caused you."
Mhm.
There's so much power in that
That
moment
moment.
that
Yeah.
we miss.
Yeah.
But I think also the reason for not apologizing as well, if you link it back to a financial jeopardy or of some kind, it feels like once again, profiteering is above the lives or experience and emotions of Black people. Again, even after all of this time, still put profiteering ahead of actually the humanity of Black people. And I think that's something there that is part of the conversation that a lot of people probably will never understand, why we continuously press for something reparation. Like Philip was saying, it's not necessarily the dollar amount. An apology at a state level will go such a long way, I think.
Deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So look, Laura, let's try and bring this home, and let's go forward 10 years. All right, let's look at a decade ahead. And you've been actively involved in the reparations movement. You've achieved what you wanted to achieve. What would 10 years look like to you down the line? What would that success look like?
Well, it's such an interesting question. My hope is that it doesn't take 10 years. I hope that the momentum that's building now,
Mhm.
that just even in the last, everything that's been unleashed in the wake of George Floyd,
Mhm.
that it's carried forward, and the work that Repair are doing with CARICOM. And in a way, you know, the war in Ukraine, the unity of the West that we've seen there, the concern about China's inroads that it's making into the Caribbean, that I know exists in corridors of power in London,
Mhm.
that hopefully it doesn't take that long, that hopefully that there is a recognition of the wealth extraction that the European powers imposed on the Caribbean, the fact that their economies were built to some large extent of enslavement, and the fact that there are legacies of slavery today. To me, none of this is too complicated or too abstract. And I really hope that the momentum that's building will lead to apologies, as the Dutch government has led the way. They've shown that it's not impossible for a government to apologise, and they've set up a reparations fund. I hope that Britain's government can follow suit, and I hope that we can talk about it again before 10 years are up.
Well, 10 years is
I want to
200 years, so that's why I picked that point in the future.
And I should say that I have to go walk the dog soon, guys.
Yeah, sorry. Are we going to wrap
I don't
up
want to get
quickly?
in trouble with my husband, otherwise I won't be
I
able
know.
to do any
But
roving
what-
advocacy.
One other question I want to take you back on that, because I know we're going to wrap up soon, but you mentioned George Floyd quite a lot during this conversation. And I wonder, what did seeing George Floyd incident do for you? Because a lot of Black people would say, but this has been happening. We've been talking about this so many times. Even if you think about, in America, Rodney King, different things happening here in the United Kingdom, stop and search, the Bobby on the beat in the 60s and the 70s. We've been screaming, we've been talking, we've been asking, and nobody listened. So I'm wondering, what did George Floyd incident do for you? What did it awaken in you?
Well, I
and
think it
even
was
your peers and family?
the widespread protest that followed and living in
Mhm.
New York City and seeing those protests up close and the intensity and the conversations that then provoked, with Black friends. So I think that it was just that, what Americans call a learning moment. And of course, that was related to the pandemic, wasn't it, in some ways?
Yeah,
Because
time
was,
to
yeah.
think.
it was
Yeah.
when, people
Stop
there were
moving.
still many
Mhm.
restrictions
Mhm.
and society was still somewhat closed that summer of 2020. So I think it did lead to a lot more reflection. And and for me
Mhm.
that was a very significant moment.
I just thought I'd ask. Okay, so as we definitely do bring it home, I'm cognizant you have to go walk your dogs and don't want to get you in trouble at home. Any final message for the people that our audience is predominantly Caribbean? What would be your final message on this topic? And not final, but your message as you continue the work that you're doing.
Well, I would just want to say thank you to everybody that's reached out to me and been so supportive and so open and given me their time. I can't thank you enough I just was bowled away by the generosity of Grenadians and the way that they really welcomed our family, despite the fact, as Decima Williams, who's the president of Grenada's Senate, she said, Laura, for so many people, there's still so much anger about slavery. And you go to Grenada, you're going to be the face of slave ownership. And that's not going to be easy for people. You have to understand that and be prepared for it. And it was helpful that she said that, because then I was able to think of that when we were there. But even so, people were just so kind and welcoming and generous and said thank you for starting this conversation or contributing to this conversation that we've been having for so long. And hopefully we can go forward and achieve justice for the Caribbean.
Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, Laura Trevelyan, thank you so much for stopping by the living room and having a drink with us. Hope as that tea, water. Not sure what you're drinking. Tea. Okay. But thank you so much. It's been a really good conversation. And thank you for being so open and willing to share with us and our audience as well. Very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for the opportunity. I
Thank you,
couldn't be
Laura.
more grateful.
Thank you so much.
We'll be in touch.
It's been great.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Wow.
Good chat, guys.
Yeah. Awesome. It's a lot to take away, It's a real defining moment, I think, listening to her journey and what the family are doing and the difference that they're trying to make. Everybody will have. It takes a lot of courage to do what they're doing, to be fair.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think you can stop the different opinions, and I think the many different opinions are merited in some form or fashion, irrespective of what the opinions are. But actually stepping forward and doing something is commendable, and not just talking about it. Loads of people talking about it in the background or want to, but not coming forward or are afraid to come forward because they're afraid of what will be said or what jeopardy they could potentially put themselves in. But the Trevelyan family stepping forward, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess I was thinking as well, in this current financial climate of inflation, I think this could be a bit of a challenge, because even though as we talk about reparations, you always do get to that stage of what does it mean financially? What's the financial commitment? That is always part of it. And I can imagine for different families with different dynamics and different access to capital and a different financial outlook and safety.
Well,
I think that would influence people's willingness to be engaged in the conversation.
I think today reparations doesn't necessarily have to be what is the size of the check that I can go and cash. I think it could be very different.
Agreed.
And I think even those seeking reparations need to accept that. And I'm sure we do. I'm sure we do. I think it can look like anything. It could be access to universities, access to healthcare, access to certain things that are there that at the moment because of the slowness of how our economies have grown and been built, that we may find it difficult to have access to. And I think that it can look very, very different, but it's still got to be substantial. It's not a little scholarship here and there. It's got to be really substantial. And I think the Caribbean going after it at the same time together is the right thing that we should be doing. And I think even families stepping forward, as I say, I think that's a good thing too, because maybe that might be the snowball effect that
Could
we
be the trigger.
Need, to get
Could be
things
the trigger.
happening. You know, that might
Absolutely.
be the trigger.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I think that's the thing. Okay, so I look, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the conversation today. A little bit different, recorded and stuff, but please get in the comments and just be part of it. Hit share as well. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, wherever you are on social media. We're there, West Indians Global, WI Global. Just follow us as well. And please hit share as well and just get as many people into this particular conversation, because I think this is a good one to listen to and one that we should all be part of, and just be having those conversations around reparations. What does it look like? What are people doing? What is the conversation around it? We talked about it not necessarily being front of mind for many people, but I think now is the time that perhaps it should be. So guys, thank you so much for joining us here in the living room. Until next time.